and it does me in ancient time. I walk upon England's mountains cold.
A very British podcast.
Benvenuti alla 34esima puntata di A Very British Podcast, il podcast che racconta il Regno Unito. Io sono Domenico Cerabona.
E io sono Federico D'Ambrosio.
Oggi torniamo con un'intervista in inglese perché abbiamo la fortuna di avere con noi Andrew Fisher, che è stato dal 2015 al 2019 il Director of Policy di Jeremy Corbyn, quindi ha seguito tutta la leadership di Corbyn in questo periodo, e quindi con lui abbiamo l'occasione di approfondire un po' questi anni di leadership laburista e anche un po' di capire cosa sta succedendo al momento nel partito laburista. Quindi ovviamente sarà un'intervista in inglese e cercheremo di approfondire un po' questi temi. Quindi innanzitutto diamo il benvenuto a Andrew Fisher. Welcome and thanks to be here.
Thank you for having me, and I'm sorry I can't speak Italian.
In due time. So you were Executive Director for Policy in the Labour Party from 2015, and how do you arrive to that position? Were you involved in the campaign for Jeremy Corbyn before that, and also how did your job look like at the time?
Okay, so I worked for Jeremy in his campaign in 2015, so he got onto the ballot paper just about at the last second. A couple of extra MPs were kind of begged to nominate him, and they did, and he got onto the ballot. There was a threshold for 35 MPs to nominate him. He got 36, and so he was on the ballot paper to be a candidate. Nobody gave him any chance. He was 200 to 1 with some of the betting markets at the time. But I worked on his campaign. John McDonnell phoned me up and said, "We need you to do the policy on Jeremy's campaign." I'd spoken to Jeremy already when he said he was going to stand. And so I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that, thinking it might only last for a few weeks or that. This was just before he got on the ballot. So I said, so it might be for 2 weeks because we weren't sure we'd get the number of MPs. And then it went on the entire summer and Jeremy won by a landslide. So we defied expectations. And I kind of spoke to Jeremy and John right at the start and said, look, let's just put forward a kind of very kind of simple socialist, social democratic maybe policy program, because I think that's where the membership is. And it was things like redistributive taxation, public ownership of core kind of utilities, all that kind of thing, ending austerity, and a kind of different economic approach, but bolder than Labour had been before. And I think that won the membership over very simply. There were other things as well, of course, but that was the core of it. And so when Jeremy became leader, after a slightly contorted process, which I won't get into, I became Executive Director of Policy for the Labour Party, which means I was in charge of a directorate of around 70 people. So there's the staff working in HQ, staff that worked directly in Jeremy's office, and then political advisors that worked with each of the shadow cabinet that Jeremy appointed. So it was quite a big operation. So that's what the Executive Director of Policy does. And they're responsible for building the party's policy programme, the engagement with members, implementing conference decisions, developing research, rebuttal, media briefings, that kind of stuff, working with the shadow cabinet and Jeremy as well, liaising with the affiliated trade unions to the Labour Party to try and develop a policy programme that, one, kind of has the agreement of people within the party, and two, can win over the electorate as well. So that was my job.
So you worked in Parliament or in the Labour Party?
So I had a desk in both, but most of my time was spent in Jeremy's office in Parliament. And he had a sort of suite of offices, so there were about 30 of us probably working there at the peak.
So maybe is for our listeners is interesting to talk a bit about the leader of opposition office, because it's something we don't completely have in Italy, but it's a constitutional power in Britain. So maybe if you want to explain what it is.
That's right, and because we have a first past the post electoral system, we don't have proportional representation. most often there are two major parties within the British Parliament, and one is obviously the government, the biggest party, and then the party with the next number of seats is the official opposition, and that gives them certain resources. So whereas the government has the entire civil service working for them, there's a certain amount of public money given to the main opposition to be able to fund research, policy making, and things like that, and kind of parliamentary debates and questions to sort of assist with all of that. And so that's called Short money, which is named after a Labour cabinet minister under Harold Wilson, Ted Short, who introduced it in the 1970s, and obviously was very useful for Labour in the 80s, where we spent the entire decade as the opposition. So, but yeah, it's to try and create something of a level playing field for the opposition parties versus the government that has the civil service working for them.
And once you started in this job, so you arrive on this landslide that bring Jeremy Corbyn to the office. What was the idea that what was the vibe around this? Were people trying to be cautious because, we're coming in, we're trying something new, so we try not to break too many stuff, or this is our chance? We were coming with a clear mandate, let's bring to the table something that's never been brought in years.
I think our approach was contradictory, but I would say necessarily contradictory. And I'll explain why. We won the leadership by a landslide. We won about 60% of the vote, I think 59.5% in 2015. So we had a really strong mandate from members, from affiliated supporters, which is union members predominantly, who voted for Jeremy en masse. Where we didn't have support was in the Parliamentary Labour Party, where, as I said, 36 MPs nominated him, but most of those were kind of lobbied to nominate him by their local party members. Only about 20 genuinely supported Jeremy, and this is out of 230 MPs. So we had a very small base within Parliament. So while we wanted to kind of show to members, look, the party's changed, you're getting what you voted for, we also had to tread quite cautiously and try and almost sue for peace from day one with the Parliamentary Labour Party, the massive MPs there, because there was a lot of hostility and a lot of people that weren't supportive. So, there was a range. So we appointed initially, or Jeremy appointed, I should say, a very broad church kind of shadow cabinet. So you have people from the right of the party, from the centre of the party, as well as some from the left. And that didn't work, and it didn't last long, as you probably know. And there was an attempt to kind of, mass resignations less than a year later and another leadership challenge. But our initial approach was definitely to try and build a bit of consensus and take people with us, hoping they would recognise the mandate that Jeremy had won from the membership. But they didn't. But in other ways, I think we were quite bold. So, for instance, Jeremy's first act as leader was to attend a Refugees Are Welcome demonstration. And Labour had been, just to give you a bit of context, the Labour Party had been very cautious. It had just run an election where one of its 5 pledges was controls on immigration, and there's a very famous, in British politics, a very famous mug that said controls on immigration that the Labour Party sold. I don't think it sold many copies of it.
I know 2 people that have that. So.
Yeah, I think some people bought it just so they could, say, here's that mug. But, so we tried to shift some things. We made some bold statements. There was obviously, every time we made some bold statement on policy, there was immediate kickback from members of the shadow cabinet or members of the PLP. So it was a kind of war of attrition. We didn't really manage to communicate with the public that much, I don't think, because we have means to get to Labour Party members through kind of emailing them and messaging them and other forms of media. But with the public, I think they probably got the impression rightly that the Labour Party was very split, very divided, a bit dysfunctional in that first year, really, until Jeremy won the second leadership election in 2016. So in answer to your question, our approach was pretty contradictory because we had to kind of balance the realities of the parliamentary level of support we had with the strong mandate we had from the membership. I mean, the other complication in this is the Labour Party is governed by a National Executive Committee, which is made up of union affiliates, members, the Parliamentary Labour Party, and some people that Jeremy can appoint as leader. And at first, I think we had probably about 18, 16 against us on that. You know, I mean, it would move slightly and depending on the issue, but broadly, we didn't have a majority on that either. So we couldn't make constitutional change within the party either. So it was quite a tough period, I think it's fair to say.
So were you starting from scratch with this policy, or was there something that you could build upon from Miliband leadership? Because there were some signals of looking to left or to trying to renew this social democratic proposal, but of course it ended up with a mug with controls on immigration on it. But was there something that was still there, was already there, that could be built upon?
So we had this kind of slight conflict whereby most of the shadow cabinet wanted to stick with where they were at that point and not move. Because policy was very heavy in our campaign, in Jeremy's leadership election, we wanted that to be the mandate, effectively. You know, Jeremy had won saying these things, being very clear about these policies, and that was the mandate he was elected on. So it was trying to juggle that. I mean, Ed Miliband had rhetorically moved a bit away from New Labour, but when it came to the crunch, and this is not due to Ed Miliband, whose instincts I think are probably better than he was allowed to express, but he appointed a shadow cabinet that was well to his right. And they constrained him, and they constrained him on austerity, where you had Ed Balls saying we're not going to borrow even for investment, you know, where we're going to have to maintain public sector pay restraint and things like this. We're not going to reverse cuts to welfare and all these sorts of things, as well as the kind of reactionary kind of tone on immigration. So there wasn't really a lot to work with, apart from kind of a few little policies around the edge, around the periphery. But there was this appetite from members to move on and be bolder. But for the first year, the party didn't really get a lot of airplay on policy, and we couldn't really express much of it because most of the people we'd appointed into that shadow cabinet didn't want to express the policies that we had just won a large mandate for, and were quite obstinate about that as well. You know, they had no humility that this man had just won by a landslide, and therefore they should kind of respect that and fall in line, and that, you know, they were there because he appointed them, you know, but they recognised they were in a majority within the parliamentary machine. And so it became, certainly when he was challenged by those mass resignations and then eventually they put up a candidate against him, it became very much who rules the Labour Party, the MPs or the membership in that 2016 election. And that's why I think Jeremy won by an even bigger landslide, is because it was framed in that way. And if you ask members who should run the Labour Party, MPs or them, you know, they're going to say them. So that was always our base. So in a sense, most leaders, if 72% of their parliamentary colleagues voted against them and said, we have no confidence in you, they would resign because that's their base. For Jeremy, that was never his base. His base was always outside the party, in the unions and in the membership. So when they resigned, it was just like, well, you never supported me anyway, so I'm still leader because I have this mandate. It's not dependent on you. And I think that probably annoyed them even more because they think it should be up to them.
So we're now talking about the mass resignation and the attempt to cause the resignation of Jeremy Corbyn after the Brexit referendum. Maybe we will go back to that in a second, but since we're on the topic, was there ever the risk? Was there ever the real risk that the project could end there?
No, because the candidate they put up was pretty poor, and you know we were elected just, you know, those resignations happened at the end of June, as you say, just after the Brexit referendum. We were only elected in September. We'd had a by-election where a lot of the press predicted we would lose it in October or November when Michael Meacher died, who had stood for the deputy leadership with Tony Benn in 1988, so was on that kind of wing of the party. And we won that with a very large swing to Labour, actually. Then there were the local elections in May. And bear in mind, you know, the previous May, Labour had lost quite heavily to the Conservatives. We actually were 1 point ahead of the Tories in those local elections across England.
And of course, won London.
Yeah. So, we won the mayoralty back with Sadiq Khan. So, you know, and we won Bristol, I think, with Marvin Rees as well, in that same set of elections, if I recall rightly. So we did quite well. And that wasn't I think they were looking for a pretext of, you're going to mess up in a minute and then we'll all resign and do this. And so they had to use the Brexit referendum for that instead of the local elections. So in a sense, for the membership, for the kind of rational observer, we're close to level in the polls. We're maybe level or 2 points behind on most of the polls with the Tories at this point. We've just beaten them, marginally, admittedly, in the local elections, closing an 8-point gap that was there in 2015. And so most of the membership just thought, well, he's had 9 months where clearly there's been a lot of sabotage going on within the Parliamentary Labour Party. We haven't really had a chance to judge him yet. At worst, a lot of people were quite angry. A lot of members were quite angry that the MPs had done this and kind of tried to overthrow the member's mandate. There was no real risk, I don't think, of losing because of that circumstance. The only issue where it could have been difficult is, as I say, we didn't have a majority on the NEC, and there was a move to say that Jeremy had to get the nominations in order to stand, which is true. If there's a vacancy and there's no incumbent candidate, then you have to get nominations. But there's never been the case where the sitting person has had to get nominations because they're there as the incumbent. They're being challenged. Their authority's already there. It's the challenger that's got to prove they have the support. So the General Secretary of the Labour Party, however, backed that and got legal advice saying that Jeremy would have to do this. But thankfully, we got contrary legal advice, and eventually I think they backed down, and Jeremy I think won by 1 or 2 votes on the NEC, that he would be automatically on the ballot, because obviously some of the MPs that had lent him a nomination wouldn't have done so again. So that was the risk. They could have done it in that way, but that would have split the party. The membership would have been, it would have been ungovernable if they tried to do that, the ultimate kind of Labour Party stitch up. So no, that was a slight risk at one point, but as soon as it was clear it was Jeremy Corbyn versus Owen Smith, and I don't want to be personal about it, but nobody trusted that he presented himself as Jeremy but more competent, and nobody trusted he had Jeremy's politics because he quite evidently didn't, and I think that sunk his campaign from the off, really.
Going back to Brexit, we would like to talk to you about that, because one of the metropolitan legend, I don't know if something you say in
urban legend
in Italy, and I think also in Britain, is that Jeremy Corbyn was like a Remainer in the name only, that someone also said that he actually voted Leave, that his heart wasn't on the campaign. So basically many people, especially on the right in Italy, or right of the left, actually, they say so that basically it's his fault that the Remain lost. So you were part, I guess, of the campaign. So how was that campaign actually?
So there's 2 things. One is, let's start with what Jeremy's real position is. Jeremy is what I would call a Eurosceptic in the real sense of that term, as in he's sceptical and has been increasingly critical of the direction of the European Union in the 90s. So he voted against the Maastricht Treaty, he voted against the Lisbon Treaty, but he was never for pulling out of the EU. He just didn't want it to go in a kind of more neoliberal free market direction. So if it stuck with the kind of Jacques Delors social Europe of the 80s, I think he would have had fewer criticisms of it. But yes, he did criticise some of the direction, some of the privatisation directives or liberalisation directives, which were rightly ignored in most European countries, but were enthusiastically embraced by Britain because we had a Tory government that wanted to privatise anything anyway. And so Jeremy was critical of the EU. He wasn't one of these MPs, and there were several in the shadow cabinet who thought all good and enlightenment that had come to Britain was via the EU. Jeremy took a much more nuanced view than that, I would say. But he voted for Remain, he campaigned for Remain. I think what mobilised him the most, actually on a personal basis, was he saw the forces that were involved in calling for Brexit, which were basically a kind of racist, xenophobic, anti-migrant force that was the driving force of the Brexit campaign in Britain. If you remember, David Cameron had sort of based his whole renegotiation with the European Union before that around an emergency brake on immigration because it was too much. So all this rhetoric had been building up, and Jeremy's, got a pretty liberal attitude to that, a very human rights-based attitude to migration, and therefore wanted to oppose that, and also believes on issues like climate change, on workers' rights. It's very important to set kind of continental-wide minimum standards, which is what the EU does. I mean, you could argue they should have been higher, and you can argue they still should be higher, but they do that, and I think that's an important part of why we sought to remain. But there were huge tensions within the Labour campaign, and this is where some of this mythology comes about, because before Jeremy was elected, Labour had already decided to run its own Labour In campaign, so separate from the main Remain campaign. And that was partly a legacy of the Scottish referendum in 2014, where Labour MPs were on platforms with Conservatives saying, keep the Union, keep Scotland part of the United Kingdom. And this really backfired, and it killed Labour in Scotland, because a lot of people said, we've never voted Tory in Scotland, or not for generations have voted Tory in Scotland. We don't want that. And the Scottish National Party were on the ascendancy, and it damaged Labour immensely. So Labour took that decision, which is probably right. The people who ran the Labour In campaign, which was Alan Johnson, a kind of Blairite minister under Tony Blair, who was now on the backbenches. He was appointed by Harriet Harman as the interim leader to lead this campaign, wanted to run a campaign that was indistinguishable from the kind of corporate, Remain campaign, which was run by David Cameron and George Osborne and, various business figures. And we obviously said, no, we need to have very clear, separate messaging that mobilises Labour supporters. And so we would have very big sort of arguments with them about what Jeremy would say and wouldn't say, and all of this sort of stuff. So there were definitely frustrations and tensions there, which probably led them to believe, if I'm being generous, that Jeremy wasn't on their side, which he wasn't on their side of putting those arguments. He wanted to put a kind of socialist case for remaining in the EU rather than the kind of sort of pro-business, the economy will fall in, fear-mongering kind of agenda that they wanted. And it worked. I mean, in the sense that 2/3 of Labour Party voters voted to remain, we did our job in mobilising Labour supporters. I mean, David Cameron and George Osborne, who were the Prime Minister and Chancellor, had 2/3 of Conservative voters voting to leave, so they didn't convince their own base, So, I think Jeremy wasn't as passionately pro-EU as a lot of the MPs were, and I think that was probably where the tension comes. For some Labour MPs, leaving the EU was worse than losing a general election to the Tories. I voted Remain, and I have had no hesitation in doing so. But to me, a Labour government will have more influence just because despite the myths of the right-wing press in Britain, the government in Britain has more power than the EU does. So therefore, that's what matters. But, we lost the referendum, and that was probably 30 years in the making, because there'd been this argument about, the right-wing press, the UKIP kind of machine, the Tories, and Labour hadn't really put a progressive case for Europe. And I think whilst Tony Blair was a pretty much a pro-European, especially in the early stages of his leadership, he couldn't do that after the Iraq War, when he broke with even the kind of right-wing leaders in some cases within Europe, like Chirac and so on, and aligned himself with Bush. So Labour lost that kind of argument back then, I think. And, if Tony Blair doesn't treat Europe seriously and sees our future with the Atlanticist kind of coalition, then what hope has anybody got of kind of rebuilding that afterwards? And I think there's a lot to be said about why that Brexit referendum was lost. Jeremy Corbyn didn't do enough rallies or didn't say the right thing, I think, is the least of them. It's just not a serious analysis. But yeah, I hope that gives you a flavour of where he was coming from and what his viewpoint was as well.
Do you think could it be possible, maybe if it hadn't happened 9 months after beginning of his leadership, would it have been possible to have a socialist case for Remain that could actually make an impact on the campaign? Or was it just the campaign was too much Tory on Tory violence and it wasn't about Labour, it wasn't about anything else?
I think there's probably a lot of truth. I wouldn't necessarily posit those two suggestions against each other. I think there's a lot of truth in both of them. So I think, yes, it was mostly a Tory psychodrama. It was, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove against, George Osborne and David Cameron for the soul of the Conservative Party, in a sense. And David Cameron called a referendum because he couldn't get a consensus position within the Conservative Party, either to just have Remain in their manifesto or to vow to leave. So, that's true. But it's also true, I think, if the referendum had been in 2018, after we'd had the result we got in 2017 and mobilised a lot more young people and, had started to be able to more boldly put our case and more freely put our case within the Labour Party, then perhaps it would have made that little bit of difference, because it was very narrow. I mean, it lost 52-48. So not, you're only talking quite small margins. So yes, if we'd been more in control of the campaign and been able to set how it was run and had that kind of fillip of the 2017 election result, maybe. But in 2016, there was no way of winning it. I don't think there's anything different we could have done that would have overall changed the result, probably, at that point.
So you spoke about 2017, so let's go there. So first maybe it's a silly question. Did you expect something like that? Let's begin from there and then...
The result?
Yeah.
Not quite. I knew we would do well, and I'd said so. I mean, we had... So let's go back to the start. So the campaign was, or the election was called on the 18th of April. And I just got back from holiday. I had a week off. It was half term and I have kids and, we'd been away. So I was quite relaxed. I was coming back into the office. And then all of a sudden there was Theresa May's got a podium outside 10 Downing Street. There's a big announcement. And we'd been planning for an election since she won, because she had this big honeymoon period. Her personal ratings were very high. The Conservatives had a big lead. There was a YouGov poll out that day, which had the Conservatives 25 points ahead of us. They were on 49, we were on 24. It looked pretty grim. But I knew that if we had an election to be able to get our policies out there and manage to do it well, I had confidence we were good campaigners and we would certainly close the gap significantly. I think if you'd asked me at that point, will we get within 2.5 points of them and, perhaps 10 seats either way of becoming probably the only party that could form a government? No, I think that that would have exceeded my expectations at that point. But I knew we could do well. And there was a meeting called, I think about a day or two later, between all the senior staff in Jeremy's office and all the senior staff and some politicians from and Labour HQ. So yeah, the staff from Labour HQ, the staff from Jeremy's office, and some of the MPs, so Jeremy, John McDonnell and a few others. And we were in a meeting room and we were setting out what our strategy was for the campaign. And obviously the staff in HQ were saying, no, it's got to be a defensive campaign, otherwise we're going to get smashed. You can't expect to win anything, blah, 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 blah. And so we were saying, look, we can register new voters, we can mobilise non-voters, we can, so we were putting together a kind of strategy to help up this. And they were saying, well, look, they're called non-voters for a reason. They don't vote, as if that's just some permanent thing. You can never win them over, never convince them. So we tried all this. And I said, look, Labour hasn't put a radical manifesto forward for 20, 30 years. This is going to feel very fresh, be very new. It's going to have an impact. And they said, manifestos don't make a difference in election campaigns, which normally is true. And I said, partly because I was slightly riled by it, I think. But I said, this one will. Very confidently. And I probably didn't have that much confidence in myself, but I just wanted to kind of push them back and say, no, look, you're going to run an ambitious campaign because we are going to do well. They didn't, but we managed to kind of find ways of circumventing that. And obviously the manifesto did have a huge impact on the campaign, and I was proved right, even though I probably didn't have as much confidence that I was right there in that meeting. But yeah, we've been testing messaging. So I'd done some polling, testing various questions and saying, is it right that this is the case when this isn't? So kind of how you frame the policies as well. So I had lots of kind of evidence of what swung Tory voters, of what swung, what convinced people who hadn't been Labour to vote, and how it played in different seats. So I was pretty confident going into that. I was sure that once we got a kind of clear hearing, we could do that. And the other thing that had changed, and this goes back to our discussion of 2016 and the coup and then the second leadership challenge, is we now had the shadow cabinet completely of our choosing. So we had no obstacle to getting these policies out. If we'd still had that same shadow cabinet from 2015, there was no way we would have been able to get this stuff through. So in actual fact, that 2016 situation, while it was horrible, was a blessing in disguise, because it gave us the freedom to be able to run the sort of campaign, put forward the sort of policies with the sort of MPs who believed in them, fronting them in 2017 that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do. So, what happened in that election campaign is pretty unique in British electoral history. No other party has shifted the polls that much from the start of an election to polling day as we did then. And it was the largest increase in the share of the Labour vote ever in Labour history, since 1945, which is a pretty unique, if you know British electoral history. Labour won a landslide after the Second World War and then introduced the NHS and nationalised a third of industry. It was quite a definitive kind of election. So, the only other election where the Labour vote had gone up that much from the election previous was 1945, which obviously had a 10-year gap because of the war. So it was from 1935 to 1945, and we'd done this in 2 years. So it was pretty remarkable. And obviously we didn't win. I don't want to oversell it. We still lost, but we took away the Conservatives' majority, and we took them from a place where they thought they were going to win by a landslide to the point where they were worried they might not even hang on. And that's quite a shift. So, it was a remarkable campaign, and I've got very kind of happy memories of it, as tiring as it was those 8 weeks. But
was there something in particular that you think you understood about the electorate that allowed for such a campaign to be so successful?
I have quite an optimistic belief that you can win people over with a good argument. I don't think there's much use in engaging in democratic politics if you don't believe that, really. How else are you going to win? But we'd had years of austerity. And I think the problem with Labour up until that point, so under Ed Miliband, unfortunately, but it's not his, not necessarily down to him, it's the people around him as well. They hadn't actually made an argument against it, whereas we put forward a bold kind of set of policies that says, look, we've cut corporation tax for the last 30 years in Britain. If we just put it back to where it was 10 years ago, this kind of wipes out half the cuts that you've done. If we raise income tax on the richest 5%, this brings in enough money to fund our public services back to the level they were here. There's no need for this. It's a choice. And it's very difficult for the Tories to argue this because it's true. It's just, it's quite easily evidenced. And people feel it. People feel that people at the top are getting away with things and corporations have, freedom to do these things, whereas their libraries being closed, they're waiting for 5, 6, 7 hours at their local hospital waiting to be seen because there's such a shortage of doctors and nurses. So it very much related to people's experiences and then put an economic argument that kind of said, the reason you're experiencing this is because they've cut these things while giving tax breaks to these people. We're going to put it back. And it's not complicated. It's an argument that people can quite easily and readily understand, but it has to be put, and you have to have the confidence to put it. And I think that's true whether you're talking about cuts to social security, a more kind of progressive migration policy, or economics. If you put an argument that is clear, true, and understandable, I think people will latch onto it. And I think that's what happened in that campaign predominantly. We had a slogan for the many, not the few, which is taken from a very famous British poem by Percy Shelley. It's in slightly old English. It says, shake to earth your chains like dew, ye are many, they are few. But, we've kind of updated the language a bit. So for the many, not the few, which has been used before by the Labour Party, but it fitted with everything we were saying. We were saying, we're going to redistribute how tax is paid. The rich are going to pay more, the poor aren't. Corporations are going to pay more. We're going to cut a bit here. So that was for the many, not the few. We're going to take things out of private ownership and into public ownership, like the railways and the energy companies, so that they're run for the many, not the few. So everything within our messaging fitted within that kind of framework, and that slogan, people could understand it. And if most people don't think they're the few, so if you say for the many, not the few, they think, oh, you're for me then. I'm one of the many. I'm not one of the few. And it's true. Most people are the many. So I think it worked. It worked well, and Jeremy was a brilliant campaigner. The reason he won by a landslide in 2015 in an internal Labour Party election, now different to the public, but it's still, there's not people overemphasize the difference between party members and the public. You still have to convince them that you're right and that you've got a powerful argument. And in that campaign, I think Jeremy shone really, and so did a number of others, John McDonnell as well, especially. There were others as well. But we managed to put forward an argument that really encapsulated what we stood for and put a very sharp dividing line with the Conservatives. And it put them in difficult situations because it raised these questions. So, for instance, there was a famous TV debate where a member of the public who was a nurse said to Theresa May, why haven't I had a pay rise in 5 years? And she said, well, there isn't a magic money tree. As if a nurse wanting a pay rise is like asking for the world, But she's given, we were constantly putting out messaging like they've given billions of pounds in tax cuts to the biggest corporations. They've cut the highest rate of income tax on the top 1%, and now you're telling a nurse there's no money. Well, there was money for all of them, So it really, I think, sharpened our messaging. And the Tories hadn't been ready for that because Labour was quite passive before it. It sort of did it on the one hand, it's this, and on the one hand, we do need to have some cuts. Whereas we weren't doing that. We were unashamedly saying, no, it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that put them on the back foot for that election. And that election, we managed to find the space to talk about the whole kind of range of policy issues. Whereas by 2019, which I'm sure we'll get to, Brexit had just become this intractable problem within Britain and had gone on for 2 years, and it was all people were focused on, and that was difficult. But yeah, for 2017, our strategy and our messaging really worked.
I don't know if you want to talk about what happened after you posted a thread on Twitter about 2017 election, and something quite strange happened because Chris Curtis, I think he was, he posted about the polling on that election, and he's a guy who worked at the time at YouGov, which is a
polling company.
Polling company, sorry. And he basically said that they kind of covered some polling because it was too good for Jeremy Corbyn and Labour Party. So, of course, he became big on the Twitter feed of left Twitter feed, and then he unposted the thread and posted an apology. But basically, he said that there was something strange about polling on that election. So, if you want to say a few things about that.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding of it is he said that a poll he did that he thought was methodologically robust was stopped from going out because they didn't think it could be right. His bosses at YouGov didn't think it could be right. And he said, well, look, we've on his thread, I only know this through reading this the same way as you. This was all a revelation to me last week as well. But he said, this is the same methodology we've used on previous polls, so how can it be wrong now? Surely it's right. And I think that's quite interesting that this came out at this point. And he also said that Nadhim Zahawi, who was one of the co-founders of YouGov and is now a government minister under Boris Johnson, had phoned up the current boss of YouGov during that time and said, not about the poll that wasn't published, but about they did a kind of big, what's called an MRP poll, which I forget what MRP stands for now, but it's a kind of constituency-wide polling that showed the Tories would lose their majority. And he phoned them up outraged and said, if you're wrong on this, you'll all be out of a job. Now, Nadhim Zahawi, I should say, has now said, that was just a joke. I wasn't serious. I was just saying, you better be right or you'll be out of a job. I mean, you don't tend to joke about people's jobs like that. But, maybe if you're a Tory, you do think people's jobs are a joke because you can always just get another one out of your mates anyway. But, I don't know the realities of it, and probably we will never know the truth of it. But what is clear is one bit of polling, it was a post-debate poll. It's how did Jeremy perform in this debate relative to Theresa May? Came out with, I think, a quarter of Tory voters saying Jeremy was the best, which is a high proportion of people who are saying they're going to vote Tory thinking Jeremy's better. So they suppressed that, and it never got published at the time. But also, it's interesting to know that there was this backlash against them, because I remember that poll coming out, and on polling day there was one set of pollsters that were sort of putting the Tory lead at 10, 13 points even, and then others like YouGov and Salvation that were saying it was down to 1 or 2 points, which was broadly right. So even on polling day, we had no idea how we'd do. We had no idea. We knew it was somewhere within that range, but we had no idea how we would do. So, I think a lot of the pollsters, because this had never happened before, that the polls shifted this much. I think a lot of them overcorrected and thought, there must be something methodologically wrong, and we don't want to look silly if our poll's wrong. And we've overestimated this phenomenon. So I think there was probably a bit of caution there. Plus, the other thing that changed is we mobilised young people to turn out and vote in that election in a way that hadn't happened for a long time. So, we'd had a big voter registration drive. We'd had kind of celebrities and grime artists. And don't ask me what grime music is. I'm too old and too unhip to know. But, I think it's a bit like rap. Kind of come out and try and mobilise, especially ethnic minority young people to kind of register to vote and stuff like that. So we'd had very targeted campaigns trying to get in university seats as well, where we'd said we were going to scrap tuition fees to try and get the electorate up and increased. So, Yeah, I mean, we did do some things that hadn't been done before in kind of electoral politics. You know, the Labour Party never really used to focus on registering people to vote or trying to expand the electorate. That hasn't really been the case for a long, long time, as long as I can remember as a Labour Party member for, you know, a quarter of a century. So we did shift the parameters. And if you're a polling company and your model says turnout amongst young people is only 40% and suddenly it jumps to 60%, that changes the results of your poll. So I can see why they were like, oh God, this doesn't seem right, but it was, you know. And it's interesting that little thing came out because it was just a reflection of all these sorts of things that were going on throughout our period of leadership, where I think we were treated differently. We were treated almost as an outsider, as an illegitimate kind of force within British politics because we didn't come through the normal legitimate way, which is you win a majority of the MPs to support you. You wine and dine all the, you know, the press and the lobby correspondents within Westminster. You know, Jeremy had never done any of that. He didn't like speaking to the press particularly. He wasn't interested in Westminster gossip. He didn't feed them bits of information. He just wasn't part of that little world, and therefore I think he was treated in a different way to almost how any other leader has been. And that partially, I mean, I'm not trying to make apologies for them, but I think that explains why they were so out of sync and sort of disbelieving their own methodology at times.
And you mentioned the complicated relationship with the Labour headquarters. That was particularly important in 2017 when Labour was so close to be in power, because with the British electoral system, you just need to move a small number of votes, but in the right places, and you get very different results. What can you tell us about that?
Sure. So, I told you the initial conversation we had about how they wanted to run a defensive campaign and we wanted to run a kind of positive, ambitious campaign. And, you know, what we didn't know at that point is they set up a sort of parallel operation in another building owned by the Labour Party called Ergon House. And this came out in the Labour Leaks report, which was published in sort of 2020, I think, in the spring of 2020. And there's currently an inquiry going on into it. But it showed that they were sort of talking about, it showed a lot of things, which I won't get into. But in terms of the 2017 election, it showed that there was money, you know, kind of the party's money being channeled in a way that had no consent from the leadership, from the electoral strategy team, you know, no oversight from the national election coordinators, who are two MPs appointed by Jeremy, approved by the NEC to run election campaigns. You know, they had no knowledge of this until afterwards, it seems. I mean, this is obviously subject to an inquiry, so, you know, we'll wait and see exactly what emerges and the scale of it. But clearly, even when it became clear the polls were shifting in our favour, they were still channeling money into safe Labour seats, and we had to try and find a way around that. And so we managed to get some of the unions to kind of withhold money and almost direct them personally how to spend it, or they had to come into the Labour Party and say, you will give this money here, otherwise we're not giving it. So it got quite tough, and we had to set up a sort of parallel operation ourselves through Momentum, which was the kind of legacy organisation of Jeremy's first leadership campaign. And they're very digitally savvy young people, and so they set up a kind of app and website called Find My Nearest Marginal, where people could type in their postcode and it would send you to a Tory seat that Labour wanted to gain, whereas the Labour Party regions were sending people to what were really quite safe Labour seats. And so we were targeting our resources in the wrong places, but thankfully most of the membership was ignoring that and following this Momentum app and going to the right places. So, I mean, look, clearly it didn't do us any good, and they were spending digital spend in the wrong places, so targeting Facebook ads in parts of the country where we were clearly always going to win those seats and not putting it into the marginals. I think, given how close the election was, as you said, I think it's probably likely that if they had acted properly and in line with what we were asking them to do, we could have probably been not the largest party necessarily, but the only party capable of forming a government. And the Tories wouldn't have been able to do a deal with DUP in order to hang on. The DUP, for people who don't know, is a kind of unionist Northern Irish party. So, yeah, it possibly cost us a minority government. How sustainable that would have been, of course, is anyone's guess, and what deals we would have had to do to try and stay in power is a different question. But I think it probably it possibly was enough to do that. I don't want to put it any stronger than that because you can't know. I like to be honest rather than rhetorical. But yeah, it possibly cost us the chance of government. It was such a marginal result. I think there's been a calculation that something like 2,200 votes shifting a different way in 10 constituencies would have effectively made Labour the only party that could have formed power. So there we are.
From an Italian point of view, this is very astonishing that a party leader cannot have the control of the headquarters. It's quite impossible.
I mean, the level of sabotage is quite remarkable. I mean, the manifesto, which obviously I was in charge of, was leaked. It probably did us good in the end because it gave people it gave the media a chance to really look at it and elevate all the policies within it. But I won't get into the detail of it, but you have to clearly consult on the manifesto internally, and it's never leaked in the history of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or any political party in Britain. And somebody from inside the Labour Party who opposed us gave it to the Telegraph, a right-wing newspaper, 2 days before it was due to be signed off officially through Labour's democratic structures. That was just an attempt at sabotage. It backfired, thankfully, from their point of view, and it benefited us because people saw what was in it and was like, actually, we like that. The Telegraph did this thing of Labour's terrible, they're going to drag us back to the 70s and nationalise everything, and people went, good, that's probably a good thing. We want these things nationalised. So, and it caused a whole debate around it for days that wouldn't have happened probably otherwise. So although it backfired, that's just another example of the lengths they were prepared to go to sabotage their own party's election campaign. It's pretty remarkable what we had to put up with in that period. And there were clearly, we've seen the messages that came out that they were sending each other on election night when the exit poll happened. They said they're all celebrating and we're ashen-faced. This is exactly what we've been working against. They were disappointed that Labour had gained seats for the first time since 1997. This is the first election where Labour's gone up in the polls for 20 years, and they were disappointed. This is some of the most senior staff working in the HQ of the Labour Party were disappointed we'd done well in an election. It's completely insane. And without precedent, I think, in British politics at least. So, I probably, I try not to get too emotional, but I probably do demonstrate that. When I reflect on it, I am quite angry about it because, I've been deeply frustrated with the Labour Party for most of the time I've been a member. It's been Tony Blair for half of that period. So I wasn't happy, but I would never have sabotaged us to the point where I was trying to undermine us against the Tories in an election. That's because even under Tony Blair, we were still the better option, not by as much as I would have liked, but we were. So to be that malicious, to do those sort of things, to direct money in the wrong places, to leak, campaigning documents. And there were all kinds of things going on behind the scenes that, if I really cast my mind back, I could tell you all kinds of just kind of quite tedious, petty, little kind of undermining things going on all the time. It was quite annoying, but it almost made the result even sweeter because you thought, well, this is down to us. We've done this, and we've done it despite them. And, these people were all people who had lost the 2015 election, lost the 2010 election. They weren't some great gurus that were doing really well until we came along. Us lefties had kind of jumped on board and sabotaged their great operation. They'd lost 2 elections back to back really badly. And then we gained them seats. It's like, give us some credit. And it's a very weird situation. But ultimately, we proved them wrong, and and it showed that left-wing policies could be popular, and that was the most important thing to that election in terms of its legacy. The legacy of that election is you can stand on a very clear, it's not that radical by continental European standards. This is kind of fairly tame stuff. It's nothing beyond where Mélenchon is in France. It's nothing beyond where, it's not far beyond where Olaf Scholz is in Germany, probably. Some of it is. But, in terms of, some things already run in public ownership. In most of Europe, the railways are publicly owned. In parts of Europe, energy companies are already publicly owned. This stuff isn't radical. This stuff isn't extreme left-wing views. This is quite normal. These things are natural monopolies. It was important for a British audience to see, and for the British Labour Party to see, actually you can stand on a much more bold platform than has been the case for the last 30 years and do okay.
So at the time, you were aware about this kind of sabotaging, or was it something that came up later?
I mean, obviously the manifesto leak was a fairly clear piece of sabotage or attempted sabotage that we knew about. So there were things we knew that were going on. There were briefings to the press from some of the press team in the HQ that we knew was coming from them. So there were things we knew that were going on. We didn't know the extent of it. We didn't know about this secret funding channel through another set of staff in another Labour building going on. We didn't know about that until afterwards, until that report came out. So we knew there was sabotage going on, but we didn't know the extent of it. If we had, we probably could have done something about it at the time. But yeah, there was a clear level of hostility towards us from some of the most senior staff in the organisation that was pretty apparent, and we could see some elements of that going on all the time on a day-to-day basis. Our budgets being withheld for certain things, quite petty things, So we knew there was an element of sabotage going on, definitely, but not the full extent. That's come to light, 3 years later.
Something that has always seemed odd to me, and also to some of us that we talk about it, is that after winning 2 leadership elections, after getting this result in 2017, at which point do you actually control the party? At which point can you actually, we were talking about the trouble with the HQ, the trouble with the NEC, the trouble with the parliamentary group. At which point can you actually impose your?
So yeah, after 2017, we were able to get rid of some of the senior staff. I think they were offered redundancies. I don't know the details of it, but I suspect too much money went into their pockets. But it got rid of them, which was good. We replaced the General Secretary, which is obviously a decision for the NEC, and we were able to do that because the NEC elections are every 2 years. So the elections had just taken place before Jeremy won. And so just after the 2017 election, there was a new set and the left swept the board on those. So we were able just about to get a new General Secretary in who was left-wing. Unfortunately, she was diagnosed with cancer shortly afterwards and spent a lot of the time being away from the office and ill, obviously very seriously ill. But she was a really good, competent person that the NEC installed. The Parliamentary Labour Party, I think, which was the big kind of stumbling block, obviously that changed slightly. You had a new intake of 30 MPs who had only been elected because of the campaign we'd run. We had probably a few more left-wing MPs elected in that election as well. So that shifted the balance a bit. And even some of the MPs who had been hostile before were kind of had enough, some of them, not all of them, but some of them had enough humility to go, look, fair play, you ran a great campaign. I didn't think you could do that. And, we're back off for a bit. And they did. Unfortunately, that whole period, a year down the line, then just got completely dominated by the Brexit splits, and that created a new dynamic entirely. So we probably did have a slight honeymoon period and a period where we did control the party and did have a majority on the NEC and had less resistance from the Parliamentary Labour Party, the MPs. But it was probably relatively short-lived, probably only a year before the Brexit division started bubbling up and new dynamics started happening.
So this becomes emotional for us too, because we were a lot involved in the campaign. Also in the campaign, we told everyone that we came to London to campaign for the Labour Party. So we were very involved, and we are still sad about the results.
Non ci siamo fatti sfuggire l'occasione di fare tantissime domande sulle elezioni del 2017 con una persona che era al centro della campagna elettorale laburista per quelle elezioni, ma non abbiamo parlato solo di questo. Per sentire le nostre domande e le risposte su quello che è successo dopo il 2017 e anche per un po' di prospettiva sul futuro della sinistra laburista e del Labour più in generale, dovrete però aspettare un altro pochettino per la prossima puntata di Very British Podcast, in cui parleremo appunto di tutto questo. Io sono Federico D'Ambrosio, vi ringrazio anche a nome di Domenico Cerabona. Come sempre potete seguire il nostro canale Telegram a Very British Channel, e come sempre questo podcast arriva grazie al contributo della Fondazione Amendola e di Left. Ciao!
A Very British Podcast.